And we will get started with Ida Lupino. So I am doing this for Women's History Month. And Ida Lupino, like Melvin Van Peebles, is just one of those, a trailblazer in every sake of the word. And someone who, in an age where it was extremely hard for a woman to make her way in, I think, any industry, let alone something as entrenched and gatekept as Hollywood, she's someone who stands out as just a really, I would say, tough cookie, as it were. So I wanted to start off with this quote. This is oft quoted or attributed to her. The poor bewildered people. Martin Scorsese talked about it when he wrote about her, but it comes from her originally saying that the pictures she likes to make are pictures with poor bewildered people because that's what we are. And there was an article in Cines by Dan Georgakis, I hope I'm saying his name right, where he writes about what Lupino wanted to make as a filmmaker. And it says, in essence, Lupino wanted to make films that would reflect the sensibility and style of the quintessential working class woman that she excelled at portraying as an actor. So rather than going for glitz and glamour as a filmmaker, she wanted to go for substance over style. But if anyone knows about Ida Lupino, she, for a while, was better known as an actress. Before we get started, so despite her being fairly well acquainted with American cinema, she was actually born in England in 1918. And she comes from a really long line of entertainers. And I'm just going to say allegedly, a lot of this is from a biography on Ida Lupino. So they can trace on her father's side back to the 17th century. And her father, Stanley Lupino, he was a British comedic actor, very well known at the time. And her mother was an actress and a tap dancer and known as, quote, the fastest tap dancer alive. Sorry, I had like a half day on Saturday and it feels like my brain is still reconfiguring itself. And a lot of people in the extended family were dancers. There were people who did juggling acts. So she grew up around performing arts, similar to, we do see a lot of children of actors breaking into acting themselves, breaking into directing. Just last month when we discussed Melvin Van Peebles, his son Mario was inspired to go into film as well. So she was just entrenched in this world to the point where when she was young, she would direct her own home movies. She would make plays. There's one story where she was trying to stage what looked like a house robbery, and someone came up and saw her, and they thought it was real, and she had to explain, like, "Oh no, I'm just making. We're just playing. We're not actually doing something." And her father was someone who greatly encouraged her to follow the dramatic arts, which you would think someone in the late 20s, early 30s, the father would be like, nope, it's not a proper place for a woman. But, he had a love of the dramatic arts and, married a woman who had a love of entertaining as well. So they saw that their daughter really wanted to do this and instead fostered and supported that. And she is quoted by saying, according to her, her father once said, quote, "You're a strange one. I think you're going to end up doing what my son would have done. You will write, direct, and produce." And as she said, that is what I ended up doing. On something that could have been more potentially tragic, she did suffer polio as a teenager and survived. And that does come into play in some of her later films. Again, this was definitely pre-vaccine. This was when polio could result in basically a lifelong mobility issues or health issues. And it made her, as we'll discuss a little later, someone who is an advocate for awareness and rehabilitation. And she got her start as an actress fairly early. She went to the Royal Academy of Arts at age 13, and she landed her first film role at 13 and went to Hollywood pretty soon after. So early Hollywood. So there's Ida Lupino. They're definitely not looking how people are used to seeing her as an actress. A lot of her, what she became known for in her later career was playing stern, tough women who, couldn't be pushed around. They could hold their own against men like Humphrey Bogart. And you see here looking almost like kind of a proto Gidget, as it were. So her first role was at age 13. This is in a film called The Love Race, which she's technically not credited for. And her first starring role came 1 year later. Was her first affair. I thought I heard something on the other end. So after her first affair, Paramount in Hollywood takes notice of her and they want her to come sign her for a contract. And when she comes over, she is styled like Jean Harlow. So again, you can see the blonde hair, the red lips, the bombshell look, as it were. But the roles that she got, and if you look at these, the films on the right-hand side, Search for Beauty, Harrison Springs, Smart Girl, these don't particularly sound like very memorable or challenging films. And frankly, they weren't. And she got kind of tired of it. She also wasn't getting any traction. She had a few starring roles or supporting roles, but it wasn't leading to a bigger career. And more importantly for her, it wasn't leading to anything challenging. And it's also worth noting that while she was, really cutting her teeth in Hollywood, she was writing scripts, she was studying what the actual filmmakers were doing. So she knew pretty young, she's just like, I don't want to just do this. But by 1937, she gets tired of getting these fluffy roles in films that nobody really remembers and just not getting something that she feels is up to her quality. So she leaves Paramount. She goes a year without work. Pretty risky for an actress, not even in that day and age, any day and age. One of the things a lot of actors, even working actors, will say is like, you have to keep working, you have to keep your name in the paper. Unless you're Brad Pitt level, you can't really afford to take too much time off. But she decided, I'm going to take some time off. She goes back to the stage and she reinvents herself. And then she becomes the Ida Lupino that we know in films like High Sierra. These tough, wise, worldly women who don't take guff from anybody. And this, especially in the 40s, with women like Katharine Hepburn, Betty Davis, these were characters that were becoming more in vogue in cinema. Like the idea of just the woman has to be the damsel, really wasn't the case back then. And as much as people like to think that, it's like, you go back to earlier films, you find plenty of strong women, even post Hays Code. So she ditches the John Harlow look. She goes a bit more sophisticated, dyes her hair dark. She actually kind of felt that she would be taken a little bit more seriously. I don't think that was entirely incorrect. I think if anyone looks at the careers of people like Marilyn Monroe, unfortunately, the dumb blonde or the bombshell blonde archetype is a hard one to escape. And she started to be a lot more selective with her roles rather than just taking anything that came her way, and also demanding better roles. So her breakthrough role for, her superstardom is The Light That Failed. And the New York Times said, quote, "The little ingenue suddenly burst forward as a great actress." So taking that time off to reinvent herself, taking that time off to try to do some theater work really helps to her advantage. And again, she gets films like High Sierra and Seawolf. So she becomes this go-to for these tough, independent women who I would say, even by today's standards, hold up as your quintessential strong female character role. But when she gets towards the late 40s into the 50s, acting roles as she's getting older, they aren't quite there anymore. I mean, again, that is unfortunately, it's true of Hollywood then, and it's still true now that, as women get older, the roles get harder. And she decided, like, I want to start making my own thing. I'm tired of the studio system. So she decides to form a production company, and that is called the Filmmakers. And as their first feature of hers is Not Wanted. So the Filmmakers, some background on that, Malvin Ward and Collier Young, and yes, the Filmmakers was spelled with one M. I've seen a couple of sources spell it a different way, but whenever I've seen the biography, it was with one M. So she leaves Warner Brothers and she formed a multiple, but the one that really stuck around was the Filmmakers. And what she wanted to do, going back to that initial thing, that statement I said, films that had the sensibility and style of the working class actors that she portrayed. She wanted these stories that were real, and in many cases, stuff that, studios wouldn't touch. Important to remember, the Hays Code was still around, and that was something that dictated what could and could not be in films. And the first feature of hers is Not Wanted, which she initially was just supposed to produce. But the original director, Elmer Clifton, had a heart attack fairly early into shooting. So she takes over the production and, directs this film due to what I'm sure is just Directors Guild of America bureaucracy. He still stays as the director, but people know that she directed it. Actually, the original title that she'd wanted for this was Unwed Mothers, and the censors would just not allow that. So she had to stay with Not Wanted. And while this may come across as something like a weepy melodrama now, or some kind of a Lifetime movie of the week, in 1949, the idea of a film depicting a young mother and an unwanted pregnancy with, sympathy, without condemnation for the young girl, without her having to die or be banished from society, was fairly groundbreaking. It's similar to, if you've ever read the book Tess Duberville's, people, this idea of, oh, this girl is not bad because of this one thing that happened to her. It may seem like, well, of course we know that now. Keep in mind, when it was written, it was a fairly revolutionary message. And from the same article in Sin East, says, quote, "Time has blurred the daring required for Lupino to even to attempt to make a film in which an unwed mother is presented as a moral person worthy of the audience's sympathy." And I think that statement is why this film has been rediscovered and is held up as something that you should watch, or as an important part of film history. Because the time of the Hays Code, this was before Lucille Ball was even featured pregnant on national television. This is also notable because this is the first time Lupino worked with actress Sally Forrest, who would be an actress that she worked with again and again. So, little segue to a very nice story. So Dorothy Arzner on the right was the first woman to be a part of the Directors Guild of America. Ida Lupino is the second woman. And Dorothy Arzner was someone that in the 30s, Ida watched and wanted to be. So when Not Wanted comes out, Ida runs into her at a party, and Arzner's like, "Oh, I want to come to a screening of this movie." And Ida Lupino is actually terrified because she's like, "Oh God, what if she hates it? What if she thinks it's awful? What if she thinks I'm an awful director?" Just very like, oh boy, crossing her fingers and gritting her teeth that she likes it. And Dorothy Arzner ends up loving it and saying, quote, "That lady is going to end up directing a picture starring Rosalind Russell, who's one of Arzner's stars and staples." Actually, a note before we move forward on Not Wanted. It was made on a budget of $153,000 and it grossed $1 million in its first year. So gets a lot of buzz, turns a profit for the studios. And Collier Young, who at this point Lupino was married to, but we will get to that later, he wanted Lupino to be in front of the camera acting, but Lupino was like, "Actually, I like directing. I'm going to keep doing this." And the studios and investors wanted Lupino to keep directing, because they saw she took over this film and she was able to not only finish it, not only keep it at a good budget, but turn a profit. And again, think about this in late 40s, early 50s. To impress a studio at that time is just the magnitude of that achievement. So her next film is Never Fear. So this is a film that deals with polio. As I mentioned earlier, Lupino battled polio as a teenager. This was before we had the Salk vaccine. And this was also right on the heels of another big polio outbreak. There was one in 1948 to 1949. And there was a lot of fear, and actually misinformation around this disease and around its effects. And what she wanted to do was basically have a film that had some hope there. So this is about a dancer. She's got a very promising career. It's also played by Sally Forrest. She contracts polio. She needs to be treated for it, and she goes into rehabilitation. And it was actually shot at the Cabot Kaiser Institute, which was new at the time and was known for its polio treatment, and used people who were real rehab patients for many as background actors in many of those scenes. So, which is again kind of, well, I don't know if it's that revolutionary for its time because the film Freaks had come out, but when polio was still such a feared disease and what it could do to you was so feared, to show that yes, there are real people who are living with this, they're able to live a normal life, was fairly groundbreaking. It's also worth noting that we had a very famous president who passed away who had also dealt with polio, with FDR. But this, it's an issue movie, as it were, similar to in the late 80s, early 90s, when movies were starting to be made about the AIDS crisis. But again, looking at it in the context of the time, what might seem fairly standard for us now is groundbreaking back then. Next film is Outrage, another one groundbreaking more on the level of Not Wanted, in that it discusses an issue that affects women, even though it had to deal with the censors at the time. So Outrage is also made in 1950, and this is about a young woman's trauma in the aftermath of her assault. And the word rape is never said, but this is still a film that deals with the aftermath and the psychological effects, which really weren't explored too much in cinema at the time. It was usually more of the social fallout. And in some cases, and can still happen, the film will look at it from the lens of how the man feels, i.e. how the woman's partner, her husband, her father, her brother might feel if she's a victim of this. So this centers the victim and is about how hard it is to deal with the police, how hard it is to get justice, and how those wounds will never entirely heal. Again, for a film in 1950, still having to deal with the Hays Code, which certainly didn't like to have a lot of stuff like this on screen. Very groundbreaking film. And this is one even more than Not Wanted, which is lauded, which kind of nowadays gets Ida Lupino a lot of feminist filmmaker cred. They're like, this is a woman in 1950 making a film about a word that couldn't even be said on screen. And there's a great quote from Richard Brody here, who, full disclosure, I actually don't like a lot of Richard Brody's opinions, but when the man's right, the man's right. She integrates an inward, deeply compassionate depiction of a woman who is the victim of rape with an incisive view of the many societal failures that contribute to the crime, including legal failure to face the prevalence of rape and the overall prudishness and sexual censoriousness that make the crime unspeakable in the literal sense and end up shaming the victim. Above all, she reveals a profound understanding of the widespread and unquestioned male aggression that women face in an ordinary and ostensibly non-violent consensual courtship. Her movie is about the experiences of one young woman, and yes, about the experiences of all women. And if there's two movies I would actually say they're not one-to-one, but they're very interesting to watch with it, it is Abel Ferrara's Miss 45, which is a very pulpy, exploitative take on something like this. But what that film does is it puts you in, from a literal perspective in many cases, in the woman's position. So you get the view of her walking down the street and her just hearing men call at her. And from the other end of the spectrum, where it's a film that's about the failures of society to deal with this problem, is a film that came out in 2020 called Promising Young Woman. I think that these would make a very interesting triple feature. So moving on to two films, kind of represents a transition period. So Ida Lupino is making money and gaining a lot of fame, and in some cases notoriety, for taking on these social issue films. So Hard, Fast, and Beautiful, it's a drama about a tennis player. She is being pushed by her mom to be the best tennis player ever, but she decides, nope, love is more important. And that's kind of the last of her very, social issue, or one could even say women's issue films. But the next movie, On Dangerous Ground, is a noir film. And once again, Ida Lupino not credited for this, but On Dangerous Ground is kind of what gives her in the studio the confidence to make her next feature, which is The Hitchhiker, and arguably Ida Lupino's most well-known movie. And it's now cited as a classic of suspense, a classic crime film. I mean, when you have people like Martin Scorsese saying it's one of the best suspense movies ever, that's got to get you some attention. One moment, sorry. There we go. So I was actually not aware that this was based on something true, because even though the tagline is "this is a true story," I'm like, is it really? A lot of older Hollywood films would say that, and then turns out it was very, very, very loosely connected to something. However, this is fairly close to an actual crime spree by a man named Billy Cook. So from 1950 to 51, he went across a number of states, took people hostage, killed a number of people, including children. So that is actually not in this film, the child death. What it focuses on is two men who were on a fishing trip. They pick up a hitchhiker. Turns out this guy is an escaped convict who takes them hostage and says by the time the ride is over, he's going to kill one of them. And Lupino did some extra legwork, which wasn't exactly done all the time back then. She interviewed one of the survivors, and she got releases, which would kind of be the equivalent to like life rights, from two survivors, as well as Cook himself. Cook was actually eventually executed, I believe, after the release of this film. And again, the film is very successful. It kind of, when it was first marketed, definitely was marketed more as a pulp suspense rather than more, highbrow suspense. But it led to the end of the Filmmakers. So the Filmmakers had been working with RKO. They had a partnership with them, and they were the ones who would distribute these movies. And with the distribution, RKO would take most of the profits. So Collier Young decides, to heck with this, we should distribute the films ourselves. And while it seemed like a good idea at the time, because these movies have been consistently popular, or at least have done well enough to turn a profit, it eventually leads to the failure of the company, because they don't have the infrastructure for distribution that RKO had. So Lupino's final film for over 10 years is The Bigamist, and it, people said potentially her most personal film. Yep, it's not Never Fear, it's this one, and we'll get into why. So this is about a man not just torn between two women, married to two women. One of them is pregnant, one of them is not. I've seen this one. It's melodrama, but it's good melodrama. And this is also the first time Ida Lupino acted in front of the camera in one of her own films, and it is cited. So far, I can't find any other example of this. The first woman to direct herself on screen in American cinema. So when RKO pulls out of distribution, the Filmmakers had to do it, and that proved harder than expected. And the Filmmakers end up losing a lot of money, and the company has to fold, which unfortunately leads to the end of Ida Lupino's cinematic directing career. She does go on to act in film, but she does, as we'll get to later, have a second life on television. So why is this considered to potentially be Lupino's most personal film? Well, she was having a torn between two men herself around the time this was made. So behind the scenes, that is Ida with her daughter Bridget and Howard Duff. So Lupino's been married 3 times. Her first was Lewis Hayward. The second was Collier Young, who was her collaborator. And then there was Howard Duff. So you look at those, marriage to Cliff Collier Young ends 1951. Howard Duff begins 1951. If you can, as you can read here, while she was still married to Collier Young, she met Howard Duff. They began an affair, and she was actually pregnant by Duff while she filed for divorce from Collier Young. And her marriage to Howard to Duff was not great. In fact, he actually did not want to be directed by her. He considered that to be unmanly, which I don't think speaks very well of Howard Young, although he would act with her on television. He still could not bear to be directed by her. And she was still able to work with Collier Young on the Filmmakers, but especially after the Filmmakers folded, that really kind of just spelled kind of the time for them to professionally part ways. Another behind the scenes thing that Ida Lupino was involved with was the Red Scare. She was registered Democrat her whole life and was definitely not a fan of Joseph McCarthy and the House of Un-American Activities. And the Red Scare kind of ripping through Hollywood, and a lot of actors and performers being and writers being very scrutinized and having their past gone through with a fine-tooth comb, and in many cases being unfairly accused and maligned due to stuff that they did when they were younger or had no real ideological interest in at this time. So she worked not just to get her, she had an actor friend, John Garfield, but Howard Duff. They were accused, and she actually worked with the FBI to help clear their names and say this was a misunderstanding, or they read one book one time or went to one meeting that does not reflect who they are now. So beyond just being, you know, a very tough cookie as a director and as an actress, in real life, when the time came to advocate for her friends and stand up for people she knew, she didn't show any fear there either. So as I mentioned before, Lupino moves to television in the kind of like, mid-50s into the 60s, and she has a fairly lucrative career in that end. For the Hitchhiker, Richard Boone, I'm going to start over, sorry. So Richard Boone, who's on this Western series, Have Gun Will Travel, he saw the Hitchhiker and he really, really enjoyed it. He saw like this Ida Lupino lady, she knows how to direct tension, she knows how to direct men, which is something that, people didn't expect women to be able to do. Even other male directors would have trouble doing it, but like she knows how to, do what I'd like for her to do for my show. So he ends up getting her in touch with the producers of that show, and she ends up directing 8 episodes of that series. And she, through 1968, she directs almost 70 episodes of television. Her most famous contribution to television, though, if you are a fan of science fiction or horror, is her episode of The Twilight Zone. So you can say in the chat, anyone here a Twilight Zone fan? I'm raising my hand. I love this series. Rod Serling was actually my first crush as a child. I know everyone's like, wow, suddenly everything all makes sense. But her episode, The Masks, which if you're unfamiliar with The Masks, an elderly man invites his son along with his wife and his grandchildren to be with him as he knows he is passing away. But he says, in order to get my inheritance, you have to wear these masks. And these masks represent the worst qualities of these people. Vanity, boorishness, nagging. And you've probably all seen this episode. When they take off the masks at midnight, when the old man passes away, they find that their faces have now been molded to these grotesque caricatures. And so they have the money, the only thing they ever valued this old man for, but now they're like, we're outcasts, we can never leave the house. And it is one of the most famous episodes of The Twilight Zone. Also, in the 5 seasons of that show, she has the distinction of being the only person, not just the only woman. She is the only woman to ever direct an episode, but she is the only person to both direct an episode and star in an episode. So the other one was the 16mm Shrine, where she plays an aging starlet who just wanted to stay in her glory days. And you get, when you watch the 16mm Shrine, you actually get the sense that she is, some of this might speak to her a little bit. But overall, she actually, when she talked about what she liked working in, she actually liked television a little bit more. She felt things were a little bit looser there. The politics weren't as bad as they were in film, and, shorter work times. So Mother on set, as I've said multiple times, Ida was the only, female director in a world heavily dominated by men at the time. And when she was working, she was the only woman in the Directors Guild of America. That's a lot to live up to. So she was also in, this was also time where the crews were pretty much all men. There might be some women in makeup and costuming, but for the most part, men on set. They don't look like the crews that we have now. So how does a woman kind of deal with that? So what she would do is she would call herself Mother. And this is a quote from the book, Ida Lupino, Biography by Donati. I hate women who order men around, professionally or personally, which is actually kind of funny, because if you've, the Marriage with Howard Duff especially, she could be pretty stubborn. And she goes, I wouldn't dare do that to my old man, and I don't dare do that with the guys on set. I say, darlings, Mother has a problem. I'd love to do this. Can you do it? And I know it sounds kooky, but I want to do it. And they do it. And so this was her way to kind of get what she needed. And she also said in interviews sometimes she would pretend to know less than she did because it would be less intimidating to the men that she worked with. And there are some people who will look at her comments like now look at her comments and go like, oh, well, how can she be considered like a trailblazer when she's willing to play dumb or be a bit passive in order to get what she wants? But again, at this point in time, she's like, I've got to use what I can to get what, to accomplish what I can. And in some cases that is, it's like, okay, just play like you don't know what you're doing to get what you need. So from that Cines piece, it says one of Lupino's problems with some feminist critics is that they often take her public statements, such as this one, for example, at face value rather than examining the text and the subtext of her films. Lupino used self-deprecation as a public relations ploy. She did not want to be perceived as the crusading woman forcing her way into a man's game. For she denied directing was a man's game and simply wanted to be judged on her performance. Many of her statements are ironic or brassy showbiz overstatements calculated to have shock value. Certainly one could not take at face value her statement to reporters that she appreciated the help given to her in quote, improving, not wanted. So that's regard when she said that, people who worked on the film helped improve it for her. And again, that's just sort of a thing to ingratiate her to Hollywood. Hollywood is a very political system, not in the way some people would think political, but political as in, if you tick the wrong people off, if you don't play nice, you could potentially never have a career or never get work again. So, and she knew that it would be very easy for her to be considered difficult or considered, an aggressive, naggy lady. The crew doesn't want to work with her. She doesn't get hired back. So she kind of adopts the nice mother figure on set. And she's like, well, this is a good way for me to complete my job. And when I look at this, I don't see someone who is debasing herself. I see someone who is savvy and someone who understands what she is up against in many ways. So her final film, She comes back to direct a feature, and she does finally work with Rosalind Russell, as Dorothy Arzner predicted, in the film The Trouble with Angels. So this is a 1966 comedy. It's set at a Catholic school, starring Haley Mills. Haley Mills, who was trying to get away from the Disney kid, the Disney kid shtick. It's a cute little comedy, but Ida was not really pleased with this movie. She had control taken away from her in many points in time on this set. She had stuff reshot without her consent, and this really was her last film, but it made her never want to direct films again. She's just like, okay, you know, the control that she had on the films that she made with the filmmakers was gone. She now had to deal with the big studios, and I think it says a lot by how the studios act versus how it was when she was her own production. She had her own production company, you know, night and day. And it was bad enough where she goes, oh, to heck with this, I'm going back to television. It is a cute film, and it was a success. It had a sequel, Where Angels Go, Trouble Follows. It is worth looking up. I just like it because, you know, Dorothy Arzner's prediction was correct. But there is the sadness hanging over it with this was just her one last time to go direct a feature, and she hated it so much, she's like, oh, not going back. So later in life, she steps away from directing in the late 60s. The final directing gig was in 1968, and she actually acts until almost 1980. Believe she played Steve McQueen's mother in one movie, but her final role was the film My Boys Are Good Boys. And she also, in addition to having a very tumultuous relationship with Howard Duff, she also battled alcoholism and really kind of strained her relationship with Bridget, to the point where they were estranged for a good long while. And though Howard Duff and Lupino separated in 1972, they stayed married until 1983-84. And it left her in that divorce left her in really bad financial straits as well. So she wasn't acting anymore. She certainly wasn't directing. She was divorced. And it was because she had a friend named Marian Anderson. She had her appointed as her conservator. And we've heard that term a lot with the Britney Spears case. Thankfully, this was not the case with Ida Lupino. This was Ida Lupino personally advocating that this woman become her financial conservator. But this woman, Marian Anderson, helps her get her life on track, gets her finances back on track. And Ida is able to kind of live out the rest of her life, you know, repair her relationships with people relatively well. She's not like hurting for money. She's no longer arguing with her neighbors. She's also starts writing down her memoirs and writing down her thoughts on filmmaking. But unfortunately, before that memoir can be published by her, Ida Lupino, she's diagnosed with colon cancer. And in 1995, after a fairly substantial battle with it, she has a stroke and passes away. No public service. Anderson said that Ida was like, if you give me a funeral, I won't go, which I do love that. Even up until the end, she's brassy. I think brassy is a great way to describe her. When she passed away, Ida Lupino had been relatively forgotten both by Hollywood and by the public at large. But Martin Scorsese, who 1995, kind of at the height of his game with stuff like Casino, Age of Innocence, Goodfellas had come out 5 years earlier. He wrote a tribute for the New York Times called The Lives They Lived, Ida Lupino, Behind the Camera, a Feminist, and wrote it just as a tribute to her. And he has consistently talked about how much his films influenced her. A few years ago, when he was on a director's roundtable for the Oscars, he talked about The Hitchhiker, and he's like, I think everyone should see her work, specifically The Hitchhiker, because this is a great guide as to how to create suspense. So I'd like to think that he had a little bit to do with the Ida Lupino renaissance that we have now. The memoirs that Ida Lupino had were eventually published. Marianne Anderson published them in 2011. She said that she finished some stuff up, and that these were Ida's writings. I don't know if there's ever any real way to confirm that. A lot of the passages do sound like how she would talk, so I think there's some truth to that. But it was published as Ida Lupino Beyond the Camera. And Anderson has done a lot of work to, she's done interviews to preserve Lupino's legacy in her place in Hollywood and her image as a trailblazer. And as I said earlier, by the 90s, Lupino was forgotten, but in the sort of the aughts and especially into the 2010s, there was more direction and conversation around women who are directing. We need to have women who are directors, but also this interest in who are the women that came forward. It probably didn't start with Catherine Bigelow directing The Hurt Locker or Jane Campion. There had to be people before. And I know for me, when I was in high school in the early aughts, the first female director I learned about was Leni Riefenstahl, which number one, yikes. Number two, to say that her legacy comes with baggage is an understatement. But there were people who are trying to go like, Ida Lupino, she was a woman director and she worked in a very sexist system, along with people talking about Louise Weber and Dorothy Arzner. So with that came renewed interest in her work and a lot of people rediscovering her works. The article that I quoted from Cineast, it's called Ida Lupino Doing It Her Way. That was written in the year 2000, and it was in the context of people are starting to rediscover her work and kind of, again, putting it in the perspective of when these films were made versus judging it from a year 2000 standpoint, which very funny that the year 2000 was 22 years from now, but what are you going to do? And now, thanks to a lot of people who've done a lot of work to, be it Martin Scorsese telling people to go watch The Hitchhiker, or people like Marianne Anderson, or film journalists like Dan Georgiakis, Ida Lupino does have a place in Hollywood history. She is the second woman to be a part of the Directors Guild of America, and she is a trailblazer. When people talk about her, they're like, oh, she is a woman who went to Hollywood, and rather than being molded into a star, she decided to take her own path. She had agency over the types of roles that she played, the types of movies that she made at a time where that was so hard to do. And despite her being forgotten for a while, she finally has the legacy that she likely wanted. All right, and of course I had to end. Again, as a Twilight Zone fan, I had to end with that image. So does anyone have any questions? I'll share. There we go.
Not a question so much as a comment, Liz. So
Here we go.
I think sounded like wanting to be called mother, or just using that is,
yeah.
She didn't want to be called the B word. So
absolutely. Reading a lot of interviews where she's just like, oh, I just pretended to know less.
Right.
I think and of course she had to be diplomatic. She couldn't just come out and say, oh, I play dumb so the men on set will actually listen to me. I think she was just like,
exactly. Smart. She's smart enough to know that's the game she had to play, right? Yeah.
And diplomatic. I think that's probably the best word to describe her. Very diplomatic, again, despite the fact that her personal life, not so much, but she knew professionally you had to really play that game and rock. And especially for her, she had to walk such a fine line, because she also had to be able to advocate for herself and advocate for her vision and get things done, because if she was too nice, nothing would happen. And then the producers would come in and go, like on a TV set, and go, well, what are you doing? Why is nothing being done? Yeah. So she had to figure out a strategy to, again, get what she wanted done.
Yeah. And So the other question is, so is Howard Duff the jerk, or, I mean, is it both of them, or is it on him mostly, or
From everything
some?
I mean, I think that comment of I don't want her to direct me, it's not manly. I'm like,
Right, yeah,
but I'm also like, well, what? Look at what year it was.
yeah, exactly.
From
Yeah.
everything I've read, it seems like it was just a relationship where very passionate, but they also were not very well matched.
Yeah, okay,
That's
yeah.
everything I've read
It's-
is kind of that's sort of how
Yeah.
it seemed.
Typical guy out there in Hollywood, and
Yeah, I mean, he also said, like, he loved how, assertive she was and how she, she knew what she wanted. I just, they came, from reading everything I've read, came across as two strong personalities, and sometimes that doesn't always mix well.
no,
And
absolutely, yeah,
that can be the case with a lot of people. Just like, it's
absolutely,
no one person's fault. It's just like, ooh, not well matched. All right.
great,
It's a
great
little
job.
shorter, but I was saying to my desk mate, I'm like, it's a little shorter because her filmography isn't as long, but at least it's not like Martin Scorsese where I'm really running up to 8 o'clock. But
No, it's very interesting.
yeah,
Very good,
I'm
thanks.
very glad that she's finally like gotten her place in Hollywood history.
Mhm.
Because again, I watching the Twilight Zone for a while, I realized, I'm like, oh, Ida Lupino, it's the first time I've seen a woman directing this, and the only time. But I mean, it's great that she's finally, her and a lot of other early women pioneers in cinema are finally getting their due, because for a while they were just kind of lost to cinematic time. And it's very similar to other aspects of history where, the only heroes we heard about, the only stories we heard about were
Men,
we're mostly men, we're mostly white, and now we're starting to hear like, oh, there are all these other people who, blazed the trail for others that we're finally learning about. All right. Oh, thank you so much. A fascinating person. She was. Also, she's someone I would totally like to hang out with. She seems like she would, get some stories and dish to you, which I'm like, yes. She would dish with all of her Hollywood. She'd be like, okay, I've got some Hollywood dirt. Listen up. I will say we Criterion released a new edition of High Sierra last year, which we do have at the library now. The print has been restored. I think it's her best role. I mean, if you want a quintessential Ida Lupino role, it is High Sierra, and she's so good in it. And I mean, Humphrey Bogart, who is just quintessential leading man, and a tough leading man at that, and she just holds her own with them. It's a great performance by her.
Well, she got top billing actually in that one too. If you looked at the poster,
Yes,
she was above him. I mean, they were both on the cover, but she was with him. So that tells you something right there.
yeah, and she she was also very lucky because I mean, the way Hollywood can work sometimes, it's like, oh, we have only one person to do a like tough, brassy woman. And Katharine Hepburn was along. So you do wonder, like, oh, how many auditions did she go to? Or see, she saw Katharine Hepburn and was like, well, that's it.
Yeah.
But the fact that she had more of as the article noted, kind of a working class sensibility, like she could be a little less refined, that worked in her favor. But
Great job, Liz. Take care.
Yeah, she yeah. So I would say look up her work. A lot of her work is free online. The Hitchhiker is on Tubi, and a lot of her early work is in the public domain. So if you just find it and watch it on YouTube, no one is going to come and try to sue you. We were talking earlier about people getting sued for downloading stuff on Napster. So call back to that joke. All right. Well, thank you guys for coming. It's a little shorter today, and hopefully we will see you on Wednesday for the Oscar talk, and you can hear me go on at length for 2 minutes, because that's the time Todd is giving me, to talk about how Pig was robbed. All right, well, have a good night, everybody.